I want to welcome you guys all to the Cannabis Collaborative Conference. My name is Kaliko Castille. I'm the head of growth for the National Cannabis Industry Association, the NCIA. And I'm honored to be here today to be able to open up this morning's keynote sessions. I want to go ahead and welcome up two of the top regulators in Washington and Oregon State. First up, we got Rick Garza from the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, as well as Steve Marks from the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, and Peter Danko from the Portland Business Journal. Appreciate you guys. Have a great day and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Kaliko. It's a pleasure to be here. And Mary Lou, thank you. And thank you, everybody from CCC who's helping put on this conference. I thought we'd start out with each of our guests, our keynoters, giving a kind of a rundown of sort of where things are, just a high-level perspective, and then over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, we can dive in a little bit deeper. So, Rick, being a guest of ours here in Oregon, we'll let you start off.
Thanks, Pete. Good morning, everyone. Where do you start? In July of this year, we'll have 5 years of retail sales in Washington. Remember, Colorado and Washington were the first two, followed by Oregon and Alaska. I don't have a lot of time. I was thinking maybe, how things have changed. A couple of weeks ago, Governor Jay Inslee decided that he could pardon marijuana misdemeanors, and he did that. And he's using that process in the state and asking, actually there's a bill being introduced to allow local governments, county governments who also have misdemeanor violations that are offenses for cannabis to also be pardoned. And so just share with you, you can see that there's progress that's been made. It's been really difficult. I think I had dinner with Steve last night, and I share with you, having been in state government for 34 years, it was exciting, it was interesting, and it's challenging, difficult today. And I recognize, at least in Washington, that many of our businesses are struggling. And struggling because of things that we could never have known, and it would take time for us to get where we are. But let's talk a little bit about the progress that's just made with respect to legalization. $3 billion in sales in 4.5 years, $1 billion in excise taxes that have been collected for the state. You know that half of that money goes to serve the state Medicaid program in Washington, which provides health insurance for the working poor and low income. Think about the benefit that provides to the state that you do if you're from Washington or Oregon in this business. Remember that the systems are very different in the states, yet there's similarity. And we'll talk about the Regulators Roundtable that was formed in Olympia 2 years ago, where we bring regulators from the adult use states and now medical states. 5 provinces in Canada have joined us, and were in Boston with us several months ago. But our system was very different, and we didn't write the initiative, but it didn't allow for vertical integration. The reason I want to bring that up is because you got to remember that when Colorado started, I always kind of jealous because they already had a regulated medical marketplace that obviously allowed vertical integration. The first 6 months, what they did was they allowed people who held a medical license to obtain an adult use license. There was already a marketplace intact in Colorado that was serving medical patients, and as you all know, just to be honest, those that were interested in recreational use also. In Washington, we started from scratch. We actually started with a conflict because we had a gray medical marketplace that was vertically integrated. And many of the folks in that marketplace had wanted nothing to do with a system that wouldn't allow for vertical integration. So it took a couple of years for us to actually mesh those into one system. And I can share that that's been rather difficult. That's not something that we chose to do. That was something that was written into the initiative. And you can see that some of the things that are happening now with respect to small farms who are having difficulty getting to market. And some of the proposals that we're seeing is to do what happened in Washington in the late 60s and 70s, where small wineries were given the ability to sell at retail. And right now, because we're not vertically integrated, those small farmers are tier ones, and some of the tier twos don't have access to the marketplace. So there's going to be some consideration there of trying to provide access for those small farms, just as we did for small wineries and breweries and even distilleries in our state in the last 20 and 30 years. So I know that I was just doing an interview not too long ago. I'll share with you, and they asked, well, there's a lot of difficulty in the industry, and I said, yeah, there is. You know, often because I've been with what was the Liquor Control Board for 20 years, the one complaint that I haven't gotten, and I shared this with Steve last night at dinner, is I've never heard a consumer complain about the system that we set up in Washington. I think that's something that you should think about and be proud of as folks that are in the industry, at least in our state of Washington, is I never get a complaint. I did in the beginning because, believe it or not, when we started with an undersupply, we were selling grams for $30 a gram. And you know that one of the issues that we have today is the low cost with respect to the product. But I'd share with you that I've never heard a consumer complain about the system that you've created in Washington. In fact, because there is no vertical integration, basically in Colorado, and I don't know how it works in Oregon, but typically the folks who are vertically integrated, the majority of the cannabis that they sell is their own, that they've either grown or processed. In Washington, you have to go to the producers and processors. You go to our retail stores, there's a great variety of product for consumers in Washington, and in some ways, because of the inability to be vertically integrated, and I was been told this by folks in the industry in Washington, it looks very different in Washington than it does in some of the other states because vertical integration isn't allowed as far as a variety of products that are available. I think one of the, as I said earlier, one of the negatives of that is it makes it difficult for some of the small growers to enter the marketplace and be viable. And I think the legislature is interested in trying to do what they can, as well as the Liquor and Cannabis Board, to assist in that. And so I think I'll hand it back to Pete, if that's all right.
Okay. So Steve, your turn for an overview where things have been and kind of where they're going, broadly speaking.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. I think this is my 5th time here, this 5th grade event. Thank you for putting this on and for all of you that participate. I do think it's an important opportunity for us to communicate with you about what's going on in Oregon and to hear from you what's going on with the industry. I want to do a couple of introductions. We have a couple commissioners in the room. And Jennifer Kern is our commissioner from Pendleton. She's over there. Please stand up. With Matt Miletus, who's also here, our newest members. You know, these volunteers do incredible work and spend a lot of time working on getting our regulations right for your industry and for alcohol, obviously. They do a tremendous job. It's always a big learning curve with cannabis, and as you know, we've been learning this cannabis regulatory scheme together for a long time now. I think that's been the hallmark of our system, is that we've worked closely with the industry to put in place what you need. Now, our original conception, you know, we weren't clairvoyant. We've run up against our burrs and things that needed to be changed along the way, but I think we've been adaptable, and the industry by and large has been highly responsive. We've tried to make sure that we communicate with you. I think, you know, you get the notices regularly from us. We've tried to make that a routine. I hope that you're seeing all of them, and that's a service to you because, you know, we've wanted you to be compliant. So the big story in Oregon is a story you know well. It's when you put 1,100 licensees together, they produce and they sell a lot of marijuana. We are producing a lot of marijuana for Oregon within the legal system itself. We are putting out our supply study about February 1 that'll tell a story of a lot of marijuana inside the Oregon system. Now, Oregon producing a lot of marijuana isn't new news. It's been a part of our culture, a part of our history, a part of our past. What is new news is that we actually know how much is in a legal system. And what is news is that as long as it's regulated in the legal system, that's not a problem. That is a problem economically for you, but as a regulator, as we look in for the federal government with compliance, that's not an issue. There's going to be a lot of discussion about what that oversupply means, and then there's going to be a lot of discussion about how open our market is. I think it was the first or second one of these conferences when I came here and I gave the Be Ready speech. It's going to be highly competitive. You're going to have a lot of competitors. You're going to have to distinguish yourselves in the market. You're going to have the capital and wherewithal to get through this market. Well, we see that's here. There's a lot of competition, a lot of distress, a lot of retail outlets, low prices, and we're seeing both in that environment successes that are making it in sort of our open market, and we're seeing people that are having trouble. We're also seeing an infusion of capital, and we can say that a part of the reason I think that our market is not responding to the market size of Oregon borders is because we have this very strong perception that federal law is going to change. And really, this market in Oregon is open to those that are looking at a broader national and international market for cannabis. We're preparing inside Oregon, I think, to do that. And that's interesting, exciting. We'll have differences about when that day comes and how long out it is. But it's certainly creating a different workflow for us because business changes are prevalent. We have had problems, as you know, and we slowed down because of workload issues, our rate of licensing. You know, we've got about 1,100 in the system today. We've got about 1,100, maybe plus now, waiting in line to receive a license. We can only do so much. The renewals process in this first round has been very significant with all these business changes, with the changes in operations. I certainly didn't see the renewals effort being as complicated or as change-laden as it was. That caught, I think, us not by surprise, but we also just didn't have the workload and capacity to deal with that issue. On the heels, legislature is going to be looking at controls. They're going to be looking at moratoriums and caps and having at least a discussion about that. I'm not sure where that discussion ends up, where it takes us. And there's a real, I think, as we look at it, whether the legislature makes a decision to do something specifically, whether they give the commission the power to make decisions to ration and limit for a time the way we do licensing. It's a conversation we need to have with industry, and we need to have it in a way, I think, that has equity for both those in line waiting and for those in the system and for those waiting for us to do business changes. I think we've got to look how to, in a market of scarcity in terms of being able to get in, how we allocate our resources, how we process them, what we put an emphasis on is a really important conversation for the industry overall, and something that you need to participate with us, but particularly with the legislature as it comes up. There's also an exciting export bill coming in that would allow the governor to initiate a compact with other states. I don't know that the legislature's going to be ready to take that step, but I do know that there are some important things that we can do to prepare and change in law when and if the day of exports comes. There are certain limitations in law that if, even without the compact arrangement, that if federal government's stance changed, there would be limitations in our ability to get to an export market. Taking a look at the statutes and the system so that we're just prepared and able to do what we've always done, adapt and change. Secretary of State has done an audit. They'll be releasing their results soon. I can't really speak about it overall, but let me generalize it. One, it says OLCCs needs more support, more workforce to deal with this issue, needs to improve its rate of inspection. So it generally wants us to have the resources to help process licensing and do the inspections. It comments on the Oregon Health Authority system. I think it puts it in a good historical context. Talks about their problems with financing and, you know, the tremendous rate of drop in cardholders. So the financial problems that are coming on that and that side of the system. And then it talks about an issue that I think is ripe for our future work, and that is oversight of labs. And oversight of labs is an issue that's difficult. The testing is complicated. It's an issue that Rick and I, and we'll talk a little bit about, the regulators roundtable have discussed about how we get states looking at those issues together so we can figure out what it is we need to put in place to really protect consumers and the endpoint of this, of what labs do, right? Protects the consumer product, establishes the market. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Pete to get us to the next questions.
Okay, so I thought we'd kick off questions with something that Kaliko referenced, Attorney General Sessions' move a year ago now. We were all kind of stunned by that, and I'd be curious to know, a year later, what you guys see the fallout. Thank you, Steve. Okay, we're back. What did it mean to you as a regulator? And did it all just blow over? Was there an impact? Steve, maybe you can start out.
I'll start. It was really interesting because Rick started, you know, before I think they even had as much guidance as we had when we got in. So everyone was very concerned. I think maybe I got a little different perspective from my seat in that change. But there was a lot of concern in the state of Oregon. But in my view, when that changed, really the U.S. Attorney for Oregon, you know, when it became clear that they would have the charge, I was much more comfortable with it. We know him. He's local. We didn't know exactly, it was up for confirmation, we didn't know exactly what he'd have to say about U.S. DOJ enforcement policies in Oregon. But, you know, we have a good enforcement relationship with U.S. DOJ. He engaged us in a conversation here in Oregon, and he made it clear enough to me, I think clear enough through his actions, that he wasn't going after the license system, that he was going after illegal behavior, and quite frankly, that's entirely compatible with Oregon law as it exists today. So in spite of the federal state tensions on the larger, you know, sort of marijuana debate, within Oregon and within the criminal justice realm, I was comfortable with it. I got to tell you, nothing I think prepares you in your career to go in when the U.S. Attorney held a summit, and there's 9 U.S. attorneys from all around the state. And I didn't actually have a presentation in that room that had, you know, all of a variety of interests and legislators. And I spent about 3 hours on my feet answering questions because no one else knew about our regulatory system, and I was there. It was a long experience. I'm glad I came out without cuffs on. So, but it's been a good relationship with them. I didn't see a great deal of changes in spite of the anxiety that change caused.
I think it started with the administration for us. It wasn't just rescinding the Cole memo. It was some of the things that you had heard and we had all heard the first few months into the administration, which led us to do something that was very beneficial. We put together a group that was made up of the credit unions and banks that were providing services for our industry in Washington, research element. We had a couple of members of the tribes, because in Washington, we've compacted with 10 tribes that are in the cannabis industry. And then obviously the regulator. We went to meet with our congressional delegation. We hadn't done that during the Obama administration because there was no need to do that. We had the Cole Memorandum, and frankly, just because it was rescinded doesn't mean that we don't follow it day by day. And we continue to use it. But we saw that there were issues going on, and we felt, let's go to our congressional delegation, specifically the Republican members of our delegation, and begin a discussion about how we set up our program. We did that a year ago. We went back again 6 months ago. I'll be honest with you, the first meeting, we did a lot of talking. The second meeting, you could see that a lot of change had occurred, or a lot of discussion, and members were beginning to educate themselves about legalization. And I could see a real difference. And I sense that today. And with the change in Congress, I suspect, we'll watch and see what happens in the next 6 months. But I think it created a chill. I think with the Trump administration there, some of the issues that others wanted to look at in the industry and consumers, like social outlets, and there had been several bills that have been brought forward, especially from the city of Seattle, those bills didn't move. So I think it's an example of a chill that occurred that we've got to be really careful with this administration. As you all know, we don't know what they're going to do from day to day. And so we don't have the relationship with the U.S. attorneys that I think Oregon has. In fact, there was a new appointment just a couple of weeks ago on the west side of Washington with Brian Moran. But we do reach out to them. They really don't spend a whole lot of time in discussions with us, to be honest with you, which is a little different than the situation in Oregon. But we continue to work on that. But I think removing that, I think the changes with the new AG will be beneficial. I think the changes of Congress will be good. So, to your question, I think it was problematic for us.
You each have alluded to the regulator roundtable, and I know in chatting with you guys beforehand, you're really excited about that, and it's not something I know a lot about. So I'd be curious to hear what that organization, that group is about, and what you guys are up to that might affect folks in the audience here. Steve, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Or Rick, you want to start? You really got the NCSLA background. Rick is, he regulates alcohol as well, and he's been around the national scene on alcohol regulation with national organizations for many years, quite accomplished in that. And Rick really was a great help to us when we were putting in place our system. As little experience as he had at the time, he offered all their wisdom, insights, and resources to help us get started. So maybe you should talk about the beginnings of the round.
I think one thing to be aware of, when Colorado and Washington were the first two states, we had very little knowledge. To be honest, we hadn't looked real closely at the initiative, but once we learned that we were going to be the regulator, we actually went to Colorado. Colorado had a regulated medical marketplace with licenses, and they had regulated it in a way that Oregon, Washington, and California had not. And so we learned a lot from them and had meetings every other week with large committees that we had formed, as well as Colorado. But as we began to see more states, with Oregon and Alaska joining us 2 years later, we actually put a meeting together in Olympia with the first 4 states that legalized adult use, and began to sharing information about best practices and uniformity. It's the one thing that I learned about in the alcohol industry, is that all the states do it very different. There's never been a real effort to create uniformity for the industry. And think about that as we look about what's going to happen in the next few years, because I believe we'll move toward the removal of prohibition nationally. It'll just take time, but the work that we're doing today kind of sets us up for that. And so we had the first meeting 2 years ago in Olympia with the first 4 states. We went to Portland, and other states joined us. We were in Denver 6 months after that. Canada and several of the provinces had joined us. And then this last winter, we were in Boston, and we had 12 states, 5 provinces in Canada. And it was really an opportunity to share some of the challenges. While I said earlier our systems are very different, the challenges are very much the same. I'll give you a great example with respect to pesticides. And this has been, we struggle with this in Washington. It was very difficult to get Department of Agriculture or Department of Ecology to assist us in determining how we would accredit the labs. And the same issues that you're having with labs here are the same issues that we're having in Washington. And so it took, think about this, 5 years later, we're working on a bill right now that will transfer accreditation of labs to the Department of Ecology, and then also transfer authority over to the Department of Agriculture with respect to what are the action levels, what are the pesticides. I had to actually come to the Department of Agriculture here in Oregon and mimic their regulations with respect to what pesticides can be used or not used, what are the action levels that can be used or not used, because our own Department of Ag, and I get it, said, Rick, there's not enough science, there's not enough research that's done around what pesticides should be used, what the action levels should be. And so to be totally honest with you, that is something that we've struggled with. In fact, we've got a rule before us right now that would require that all product, right now it's only required for medically compliant product, that all product be tested for pesticides and heavy metals. One of the things that's happened, because it's only required for medically compliant product, is our medical patients are having difficulty getting medically compliant product because of the expense involved in having the pesticide and heavy metals testing. We believe that if we required it for all product, that would change and the likelihood that our labs would purchase the equipment that's necessary to do that testing. That's just a really small example of the difficulties that we've had. And so the roundtable is an opportunity for us to pick up the best pieces that work for our states, whether it's packaging and labeling, whether it's lab integrity, whether it's pesticides, licensing, enforcement compliance, the legal issues that are challenged by not only others. I mean, one thing to always keep in mind is this balance that the regulator has. Not only do we regulate this industry, but we have the balance of public health and prevention and the concerns that they have with respect to youth access, adult use in our state. I mean, that's one of the good stories, both in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, is we haven't seen a significant increase in youth use. And when in Washington State, we used a healthy use survey that's done about 150,000 kids throughout the state, 8th, 10th, and 12th grader. The obvious question always in that, and has been over the years, what percentage used in the last 30 days? The thing that was remarkable to see, because I think public health and prevention community were convinced there would be a significant increase in use, we saw that it was flat. And I mean, that's a good testament for those who are very concerned that if you change this policy and remove prohibition, you're going to have huge use for youth and an increase in adult use. And to be honest with you, in our state, we haven't seen that, and that's a positive thing, I think. But go ahead, Steve.
So the regulators roundtable is really exciting to me because the states come together, we talk about our common issues. It was really helpful to me, but when we got started, and then, Oregon had the advantage of watching Colorado and Washington take their steps into this, and because of some of their missteps, we actually got some things right and we're able to do them. They've evolved their rules now to more closely, I think, match some of those innovations that we changed. But now we're finding that we're in demand in talking to a lot of the new states across the country about how we set up our systems. What do we do? What's important to you or to them in considering set it up? It's really exciting that New York has legislation that's going to go through their legislature. And one of the participants from New York is key to their construction of their legislation that Governor Cuomo is moving forward with. New Jersey is right there. I think they're in a close competition on who's going to get it through their legislature first. But it's been an important technical aid. So in terms of governance, budgeting, our roundtable has been helpful to them because we've been able to make connections. But I think the roundtable is going to be potentially, and it depends, it's hard to form a national sort of identity and organization, but I think it's going to be an important player in defining what happens as federal prohibition ends. I kind of call this period the pre-post federal prohibition period. And Blumenauer's bill, you know, really allows the states to have their rights. Says TTB might have some authority, which is the same body that regulates alcohol. But I never really say what the federal government's going to do, and I suspect that they're not going to do as much. And the harmonization, how you think about trade and commerce and standardization, and how we make that work in a nationalized system is something that I haven't seen, frankly, a lot of good thought put into. How this really rolls out as you look at sort of the potential in a coming day. I'm not sure that potential's 2 years out. A lot of people think it is. It may be longer, but the potential for that needs to be thought through. In alcohol, the Rockefeller Foundation financed a study. It was called Towards Alcohol. There's no corollary in America for towards marijuana. And it talked about, it set up the system that set up control states and open states and gave states the choice about how they looked at alcohol given the 21st Amendment. And we need that thought going into what we do next. It's vitally important to all of us in Oregon. Particularly, I think we're going, you know, we've got a tradition as an illegal export state. We've got a lot of supply. It would certainly be something that people are thinking about economically to grow Oregon jobs and the Oregon economy. And it's something that we need to put more thought into. So I'm looking forward to seeing the roundtable evolve. I think it has every opportunity to do that. We'll be meeting in Alaska in the summertime.
Sorry about that. One thing that's interesting that you learn from the new states, because they're doing things that we didn't anticipate or consider. When we were in Boston, Massachusetts, New York, and California, and especially the large cities of California, are creating social equity programs that we didn't envision back when we started 5 and 6 years ago. And it was really an opportunity to, you know, serve diverse communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs: women, veterans, small businesses, and communities of color. That's been something that we've looked at in our state, and we're actually looking at creating that program in our state. But that's an example of the progress that occurs when you're looking at creating new systems that other states learn from their experience of looking at what was happening in Canada also, and in the provinces.
You mentioned social equity. I'll just throw in the city of Portland is doing a social equity piece through the 3% city tax that on cannabis sales that are allowed in Oregon. Steve, you mentioned the likely end of prohibition nationally and what that could mean. One of the things that it could mean, I'm guessing, is some kind of national standards for packaging, which right now, as I understand it, are a state matter. And I know that Rick, in Washington, you guys have been doing a lot of work on packaging. There's some change going on there. Perhaps you can give us an update of where things are and where they're headed.
So remember, we started 6 months after Colorado, and in the midst of watching what was happening in Colorado at the time, there were stories of people who were consuming edibles and infused products that had high concentrations, milligrams of THC, 400, 450 milligrams. And so we actually created, by emergency rule, a section on packaging and labeling for edibles and infused products. And let me say one thing. When that was happening, the public health and prevention community and citizens came to the board and said, you should just outlaw edibles and infused products because of what's happening in Colorado. And our response was, no, you can't do that. You've got to strictly regulate that product, but if you do that, all you're going to do is feed what was the gray market and the black market for cannabis. And so we put pretty strict regulations in place, and Oregon even more strict after us, of 10 milligrams per serving, 100 milligrams per product, as you're probably aware. And then we also created this rule that said that the packaging and labeling cannot be especially appealing to children. And I can tell you that's a really difficult thing to meet. And so as we went through, we have a 4-person committee that approves all packaging and labeling for edibles and infused products. What we found over time, because we got complaints from public health and prevention, is that some of the packaging seemed to appear to be especially appealing to children, colors that mimicked the way that candy manufacturers make products for children. And so we took it back, we looked at it, and then I think we initially moved too quickly. And so working with the industry, we pulled back, sat down at the table with them, and came to some agreements for how we could more strictly regulate that packaging and labeling so that we didn't have the criticism that some of it looked like it might be appealing to children. But you can imagine how difficult that is, because again, what's appealing to a child can be appealing to adult, whether it's candies or the other products that we sell. So I think it's the term especially appealing that we draw upon, but I can tell you that's a very difficult regulation to enforce. But we worked with the industry to come up with colors and shapes that would not be allowed to try to move this toward more adult-looking product, which has not been easy.
Steve, is there anything going on in Oregon in that regard?
Well, yeah, I mean, we are making changes. We just did our packaging rules again. You can expect that now that we have those in place, that we're going to go out, and we haven't really done a great deal of proactive retail inspections. Retail community, hear me. We're going to be out the beginning of this year and begin to do and look at packaging and look at retail on that regard, as well as you can expect our minor decoy and inspections going on. But let me get back to packaging. Oregon, put in place, and I was dubious about how this process would work. Pre-approvals of the labels. You have the generic labels, but we have label pre-approvals. I am astounded and surprised. It had its warts and bumps along the way as we learned it, but it's gone amazingly smooth. I mean, I thought we're never going to be able to do this. There's too much controversy around these. How are we going to harmonize even our own judgments inside the agency about what's, appealing to children, what fits? But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong when you catch me in the hallway, but from my perspective, that has gone amazingly well. We've had difficulties with different products and what needs to specifically go on the labels at different times, but we've been fairly readily able to get past those warts. But as you look at, harmonization, one of the first things that states need to figure out is whose universal symbol is actually universal. We all have our own universal symbol. They're all a little different. I think that's going to be an important thing as we look to the future of cannabis. And I think it's going to be very concerning to the industry to hear that, maybe packaging is going to change with some harmonization that takes place either because the states see ways that they want to harmonize it or because the federal government's more involved in working with us. But, imagine, I think about brands, and if I'm a consumer and I'm getting brand in one state and brand in another state, I'm getting a different product. And today that's the case. That's the way we've got to do business. We have different standards. As we look for that early on, we may develop ways that we understand the standards of those other states and we trust those products coming in, and they understand ours and they trust those products going out. But, as I said, this is an area where no one's given it a lot of detailed thoughts, but there's a lot of important issues coming, I think, in that regard.
I think we only have time for one more question. And that's the question is, we've talked about harmonization and what it could mean for businesses in a sort of post-prohibition era. Is that something you guys are talking about on the roundtable? Are you guys talking about bringing policy ideas back to your states so that Oregon and Washington can be better positioned, businesses can be better positioned to be successful when the walls come down?
I think that's the goal, to have like model legislation or model rules. I'll be honest with you, we only meet once every 6 months, and we spend so much time zeroing in on the challenge or the issue that we're having that day that I think we could formally, I think it's probably why we need to formally organize, is because we don't really get oftentimes into the meat of what that policy should look like, because we're so caught up whenever the problem is of the day. And it feels like every 3 months or 6 months there's another challenge to us in our states. I'll share one thing that's kind of interesting that I'm hearing in discussions, and sometimes we'll bring different people into the discussion, whether it be industry or public health or prevention, to our meeting to share information and then leave us. I'll share with you, when you look out to the future, that there are questions that we're getting in Washington from members of the legislature and others about taxing cannabis by potency rather than placing a flat tax on all product. And so I bring that up because I think that's going to be a discussion, at least in our state, not during the session, but probably during the interim, because obviously that's pretty disruptive. If that were to change immediately, there are going to be winners and losers with respect to that. But there are people that are very concerned about how strong, and that people come into our stores, what do they immediately look for? I want the highest THC. I want it at the lowest cost. And that creates concerns, so you know, from the public, because we don't have a lot of research about what the long-term impacts are of high-potency cannabis over time, that I'm just going to share with you. I think that's going to gain some traction, that maybe that's how we get people to be more considerate about the potency that they're using when they have cannabis. And I've talked with retailers and growers and processors who do not like this reach to the top, got to have the highest potency, not recognizing that you can have lower potency cannabis and enjoy it just as much, if not more, than having to reach to the top with respect to high potency. That's something that I want to work with our industry in Washington to talk about, is how do we begin to educate the consumers about this whole issue of potency, which I think concerns a lot of people in our state. Thanks.
Before I turn to Steve, I know he wants to make a last remarks. My friend Mark Pettinger from the OLCC asked me to mention that there is a regulator booth, booth 125. So there'll be folks from OLCC, OHA, DOR, Department of Water Resources, and DPSST. I don't know what that is, but Mark does. Steve.
Department of Public Standards, Safety and Training. So I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank the industry. You've been great for us to work with. You know, we went out and there was some skepticism when we initiated Operation Good Harvest to go look at the outdoor grows and do those proactive inspections. But it was really important to us, to OLCC, to do our job. And I think it was important for the industry to create your track record of compliance. And, you know, we found in the end, you get about 10% of folks in the outdoor grow community that have significant issues with how they're doing business and their licenses. I was recently on Vice, and I messed up in the interview a little bit. I broke my concentration because I was talking about the good compliance rate, and I thought it was really good, and he thought that 10%, he turned it into a question about diversion. And it wasn't 10% diversion, it was 10% problems with OLCC's regulations that were significant. I was kind of amused by his twist. But you know, that is good. And we got to recognize that that's good. There's more work to be done there, you know, and there's equity. We're going to get out and do the outdoor grows. But I appreciate the industry appreciating our role for compliance. And I know if you're in a line and you're waiting and you got investment, we're doing the best we can with all of our resources. We are prioritizing. We're working as hard as we can to streamline the last few things that we got, but it's going to be a frustration until we get more resources in place. And you're going to have to ride with us on that expectation that business changes are going to take a little while. If you're in the backlog after June of last year, July 1, that it's going to take us a while to get to you. But we're not unconcerned about your system, where you're at, your circumstances, and we're doing our best to help out there. I appreciate what the industry's done. You've done a great job for the consumers. You've done a great job in helping us evolve our regulations, and look forward to us having success in the future. Thank you very much.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.